Hi, I'm Dave Sterrett, and I'm going to ask you a question. Is it possible for us, audience, is it possible for us to know the truth about Jesus historically if we didn't have the New Testament? If we got rid of the New Testament, could we know historically that Jesus Christ died, he rose again from the dead? Well, today we have a very special guest, America's foremost cold case detective, J. Warner Wallace. He's a national speaker. He's been featured on Dateline many times, and he's a best-selling author. And we're here to talk about his new book, Person of Interest. I highly recommend it. And so, Jim, it's great to have you on the show.
Well, good to have you on the show. I guess before we even start, we should just say, well, look, there's nothing you can know. We would know nothing about Jesus if not for what's recorded by the gospel authors in the gospels. So that's just the reality of it. This is the case that we are looking, we trust, we have to return to the gospels for any of our data. But what's amazing to me, and as a skeptic, I would always think this, that is, hey, if Jesus is who he said he was, do you mean to tell me that the only record, the only dent he made in history is these four gospel authors? Well, it turns out, no, of course, if he's who he said he was, we would expect that his story would reverberate across all of humanity and that we would find it reiterated, repeated, reconstructed in the most unusual places if he is who he said he was. And so what we're looking at is saying, hey, if every New Testament was destroyed and you didn't have anything in the crime scene of the first century, could you reconstruct that? Has he had the kind of impact that God would have in such a way that you could reconstruct his story from every aspect of human history? And that's what's amazing about Jesus of Nazareth. It's not just, of course, the claims of the authors of the Gospels, and that, of course, is everything we trust, but it's that he's had such an unparalleled impact on everything else in history. And that's what we're talking about in Person of Interest.
Yes, it's fascinating. I want to get into some of those topics in a little while about the influence of the arts and science, but maybe you could share with the audience just a little bit about your story and some of the tools that you use as a detective and how that applies to your investigation of Christ.
Well, and I was not a believer until I was about 35, and I just didn't really have any interest at all. The believers I met, I was not all that impressed with, to be honest with you, in terms of their ability to defend what they believed. And I also was not raised in a Christian setting, so I didn't start off with any real base knowledge or no Bible in our home that we'd ever read. So that kind of stuff I needed to kind of ramp up. I was behind the curve, but I did have some skill sets that we could use to test eyewitness claims, even if they're on reports in which I have no access to witnesses or no access to the report writers, because those are all my cases. I work unsolved murders, where usually my investigator, the original investigator, is no longer available to me. The original witnesses are now passed away. How do you reconstruct what happened? Now I will tell you that there's a strategy we use in what are called no body murders, where somebody kills a wife or a business partner and gets rid of the body and then claims they have no idea where this person went. And sometimes they're just taken as missing persons reports, and sure enough, we can't do much with it until years later. And then you have no body ever recovered. You got no pictures were taken of the original house because nobody thought it was a crime scene. It was just taken as missing persons. And so what do you do when you have an empty crime scene? Well, the same kind of thing that I've been doing for a number of cases like this in Los Angeles County. By the way, DAs hate these cases because there's no body. You got to demonstrate two things to a jury. Number one, that there's even a murder. Okay. Because and number two, that there is, that he's the killer or she's the killer.
I was thinking that this story that you opened this book with, it just captivated me. I'm listening to the audiobook first before I bought and you do a great job in the audiobook too. That's one thing I like, is because often you read a book and it's someone else reading it.
Right.
I like that you read your own audio version, and that story captivated me. But here you are, this situation where Tammy is dead, and it's a decade later.
Yeah.
And the technology.
Yeah. And I've had some of these cases where it's 2.5 decades later, it's 25 to 30 years. And so what do? You basically tell the jury that if that day that she vanished, if that was actually a murder that occurred, well, that was an explosive event. But every bomb is preceded by a fuse that burns up to the detonation, and then by shrapnel and debris all over the blast radius. So we'll make a case for what happened on the day of the detonation by simply looking at the fuse and fallout of the explosion. Well, the same thing could be used to investigate Jesus. If you thought, okay, just for sake of argument, Or maybe I don't trust and I'm not interested in reading your stupid Bible. Okay, fine. Well, it turns out you would know everything you need to know, even just from the fuse and fallout of history, because that's the kind of explosion that occurred in the first century. There's a reason why we call it the first century. You can argue, well, yeah, it's because Christians did the calendar. But the point is, we've all been resting on this break in history in which we have a common era emerges from before the common era, or AD emerges from BC. And the question then becomes, well, what is it? Who could account for such a global phenomena in dating, for example, or a global phenomena in culture? And this is why I think Jesus is a person of interest. And I think when you see the impact, I think a lot of us just don't have any idea
Hmm.
of what that impact is. We weren't taught this in school. I certainly wasn't. I went to public schools here in Los Angeles, so maybe that's why. But the point is, it was not part of my education. And even
Yeah.
as a Christian, uh, no one in the church, when I first walked into that church, they weren't really talking about this. I had to dig it up.
Hmm.
I always, by the way, that always intrigued me that, the gospel was preached in the
Yes.
first church that I walked into. Don't get me wrong. Um, and he talked about the Bible a lot and read through the Bible a lot, but never once made a offer. Here's why this is true.
Hmm.
There was always an assumption, at least, that this is true, and then from there we move forward. And so for me, as somebody who wanted to know, well, yeah, but why should I? Why? Okay, this is nice, but I suppose I could, read Peter Pan and get a lot of wisdom out of the Peter Pan book too. But I'm not sure why would I believe it's true. And that was something I just had to kind of do on my own. And I think the skill set I had as a cold case detective, I wasn't actually assigned full time to cold cases, but those are always part of your, unfortunately, part. If you work in anything in an investigative agency, some things don't get solved, and those
Yeah.
kinds of unsolved cases remain on the books, and eventually someone's got to deal with them.
Well, one of the things that you bring up in your book is you make the
Mhm.
case that it was very important the timing in which Jesus came. And I've often wondered
Mhm.
that too. I'm like, well, wouldn't it be easier if Jesus just came now with all the technology and social media? He could get
Mhm.
on and do his miracles for everybody to see, the whole world would know. Why do you believe that Jesus came when he did? And why was that so important?
Well, I think I've had the same kind of questions, and I had that question even early on. I kind of felt like this is as a new investigator of Christianity, I kind of felt like this is a really dead religion, right? I mean, it's 2,000 years in the book. Nothing new's happened. I don't know, why would anybody believe that this is even relevant? This is my view as an atheist. And I just couldn't understand why. Look, if this is God incarnate, well, wouldn't you expect him to come like, come right now? There's more people, better
Yeah.
ways to communicate to those people, more technology to which to communicate. Why not come now? Wouldn't it be better to come now? Well, I don't know. First of all, in the book, I offer three three strands of the fuse that burns up to the appearance of Jesus. And this is an illustrated book. So as you look at the book and all the illustrations, I think it'll help you to see this red zone of opportunity that occurs in the first century, which is very unique to Jesus. Okay, but without going into that in too much detail, I will tell you this: I have the same question. I've had atheists on YouTube who have said, it would have been better for him to come now. It's stupid to even suggest that somehow the first century is a better time to come. But the reality of it is, I'm not sure, and I'll tell you why. I am sure, but I'll just for sake of argument, I'll tell you why I think this is not a good time to come. Number one, do you believe anything you are reading right now, especially in the last
Exactly.
2 years? I don't know what news source to even trust, and even what appears to be a neutral news source, I suspect, is spinning something. I don't even
Fake
trust
news.
those. Yeah, I mean, seriously, look, I work in law enforcement, but I'm
Mhm.
in Los Angeles County, and I have come to distrust what used to be neutral agencies. Those
Mhm.
neutral institutions I thought were not ever going to be a problem, would never be politicized.
Yes.
I don't trust that's the
FBI.
case anymore. Yeah, I don't trust it's
Yeah.
the case anymore. So I think we're at the point of least trust, not just in news media sources, but even in what we used to think were neutral institutions. And that's number one. Number two, I think we're in the technological point. If you've watched any Marvel movies in the last 2 years, where I think we could probably recreate almost anything visually,
Yes.
yet none of this stuff has actually happened. So I
Right.
don't know that even having a visual media source would convince me of something, given that most of our eyes fool us in all of these movies. That's
Yeah.
number two. Number three, it turns out this is the thing I think is even more important. And I'm sensitive to this, even as you are, Dave, because here we are producing digital content, right? We're doing an interview on
Right.
YouTube, and eventually you'll have hundreds of these. Now, the point is, it turns out, let's just say that 10 people watch this interview. I hope there's more, but if it's just say it's 10, those 10 people are not going to download the video. Those 10 people are going to watch the video and go on their way. Now,
Yes.
if we had a book though, or you wrote this on a manuscript, or you could somehow engraved this in some way that it takes up physical space, and we got 10 of them in the hands of people who are interested, those 10 documents will actually occupy 10 different geographic locations. And it turns out 1,000 years from now, it'll be harder to destroy a message, especially if you said, okay, well, my video got 100,000 views. Well, if it had 100,000 printed copies located in 100,000 different geographic locations, that's a much harder message to destroy. And that's exactly what has to happen in the first century. And that's why the story of Jesus for 2,000 years remains in every physical nook and cranny of the world. We are
Yes.
finding new materials all the time. This would not be the case if he comes, and the first appearance is in a digital age where there's almost no need for the printed word. And that's where I think we get that. That's the biggest difference. I do think that he came at just the right time. And by the way, as I talk about in the book, culture aligns, alphabets emerge, languages are being, and people will say, well, yeah, but there's a better language. Look, because when Rome adopted anything, it became so widely used because of the power they wielded that it doesn't even matter if somebody had a better system, or if somebody, once Rome adopts it, forget about it. Now, also, I will say that I've talked about this, and I've had people push back a little bit. This idea that papyrus is an important invention in this process. Yes, you could some things do last in like clay tablets as long as you don't move them,
Hmm.
they will last. But if you're looking for the one type of media that, number one, is cheap, available, and moves frequently. Yes, it will deteriorate just like clay will break, but this stuff will move a lot better than stone. It'll move a lot better than clay, and it's not as fragile. And you can roll it. You can do, yeah, you can travel with it. You have to worry about two papyruses bumping into each other. You do with clay tablets. There's an advantage to having papyrus available, the language, the Etruscan alphabet available, Koine Greek available, all of this emerging during the Pax Romana. And if you look, for example, I was just reading through Revelation with my wife. We were now we're all the way into Psalms. We went to Revelation to Daniel, into Psalms. But when we were Revelation, I was looking at the 7 churches. There's a couple of those churches that, if you look at them historically, they were planted by Paul, who used Roman roads to get there that were not even available to Paul 200 years earlier.
Wow.
But it was because of that historic ramping up of the infrastructure of Rome. And, all roads lead to Rome.
Yes.
That truly is something that afforded the first believers the opportunity to travel with the message of Jesus.
That's fascinating. I remember reading that part about the infrastructure of the
Mhm.
Roman roads, and at the right time, and with the Greek and Latin, languages being known at that time, he did come historically at the right time. One of the things that you mentioned in this book is the Old Testament prophecies. And I was just, starting the new year, I'm reading Matthew at the start of the new
Mhm.
year, and there are, like, for example, when it talks about Herod coming in and killing the babies, there's a prophecy, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to
Right.
be comforted. Sometimes they seem kind of obscure, right? They
Yeah.
seem kind
Mhm.
of, but you make the case that these prophecies of the Old Testament, of Daniel, of
Mhm.
Isaiah, that they point towards Christ and we can know it. What is the significance of those prophecies that you discovered when writing this book?
Well, and I'm pretty skeptical about prophecies, and I was never, to be honest, much impressed when it was offered as an evidence by a speaker, because a lot of times it seemed to me that if I was to read that prophecy in the time in which it was written, would I even think it was a prophecy? Would I even think it was pointing to a Messiah? If it was prophetic, would I even accept it as messianic? I just didn't think a lot of them were. I thought a lot of them were rather obscure, rather esoteric, or rather cloaked That's the best way to put it, because it turns out at crime scenes, you have two kinds of evidence. You have clear evidence, like if I leave a fingerprint and I've got a good fingerprint database or I've got a good DNA database, I can actually identify who it is I should go knock on their door. I can identify that because the clear evidence at the crime scene points to a suspect from the onset before I ever meet him. But there's also going to be something at the crime scene, I'm sure, like it'll be a torn piece of fabric or a button or some, I've had one case where it was a piece of foam. Well, I'm not quite sure where this comes from. I'm not even sure if this is part of the crime. For all I know, it was laying here before this thing even started, or maybe it came from the victim. I just can't figure it out. I'm not even sure it belongs to the suspect, let alone doesn't point to him. Well, then it turns out, though, if I knock on his door 2 years later because of some other set of evidences, and it turns out I find a shirt with a missing button, it matches the button at the crime scene. Well, now I know that cloaked piece of evidence that I wasn't even sure belonged to a suspect actually identifies the suspect in hindsight. Clear evidence identifies the suspect from the onset. Cloaked evidence identifies the suspect in hindsight. Well, this is true of every crime scene. It's also true of the prophecies. Some of these prophecies are clearly pointing to, even Jewish people will accept some prophecies as messianic, but others are best used after you've identified your suspect because the button matches his shirt. And what you see in the New Testament is a lot of biblical authors who are trying to argue that this button matches the shirt of Jesus. And so I think we would never say, well, disregard any kind of cloaked evidence. No, we would use those. We're going to use those in trial. I think it's fair for the disciples writing the Gospels to use something similar in citing those kinds of. But I also am skeptical, like everybody else. So if you
What was your
wanted to do-
favorite prophecy? You mentioned it several. What stood out to you?
Well, I think I love Daniel prophecies in Daniel 9 because they give you a time frames of, because like in the end, I don't know, maybe somebody else has done this. I had never seen it. What I try to do in this book is everything's timelines. The fuse that burns up to the first century, the fallout that follows, it's a timeline.
Yeah.
So I thought in terms of prophecies, I'm not really interested in clustering the prophecies up. These are the ones about the birth of the Messiah. These are the ones about the reign of the Messiah, the death of the Messiah. No, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to see, when do the prophecies occur in history, and what emerges and when does it emerge? It turns out that, there's those 6 questions you ask in any investigation: what, when, how, and where. But if you ask just those questions, the what, when, how, why, and where, you will not ever identify a suspect because you need a who. That who question's got to get answered. Well, it turns out if you follow the timelines I show it to you, you'll see that you couldn't clearly answer the who question until the first 5 questions were answered in history by those prophets. So I'm looking at it and saying, well, gee, and it turns out that one of the great things that Daniel does is he provides us that small window of opportunity, about 500 year, 450 year window, which then, of course, if you overlap that with the cultural window and the spiritual window that I talk about in the book, you end up with this 100-year window. And that is a window in which Jesus actually arrives. So there is a reason why he arrives, as Paul says in Galatians 4, in the fullness of time. And it's because God has orchestrated the fuses to burn in such a way. And what's really powerful about that is that if you look at the cultural fuse of all the empires that rose and fell, and then the roads and the postal service and all the things that come into place, and often you'll see that it's the destruction of one empire that leads to a slightly better version of the next empire with slightly better infrastructure paving the way. And we often think, well, no, if God's going to be in charge of paving a way, it's going to be a very sweet, painless kind of a ride, right? Because God's in charge. But it turns out that history always indicates that God uses all kinds of things that seem catastrophic to accomplish something spectacular. This is also true for our individual lives, right? I mean, we think, where's God in my life? But we have a tendency to only look for him in the valleys and ignore the fact that he's used a number of valleys to give us a number of peaks. And when we're in that peak moment, we got to look back and say, no, even the valley was part of God's plan. It's not just all peaks. So I think it's important for me as I kind of research history to see that is how God works.
I like in this book how you then show afterwards, you lead up to that point, and then you show the impact, the fallout, and what happens afterwards, the impact of Christianity on the arts and then science
Yeah.
and literature, education. And the issue of the arts, is one of those things that so often we think it's just been overtaken by a radical left and but one thing I'm amazed in this book is, one, how good of an artist you are with these pictures, but also you talk about even early on that there were Christian artists in the first centuries who used every method possible. And some of the most innovative thinkers pre-Renaissance, then Renaissance, were in
Right.
fact Christians who are doing art about Jesus. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact that Jesus had on art?
I think most people think because they look at maybe what they think in the movie industry or whatever, and they just don't have high regard for Christians in the arts. And I will say something controversial I didn't say in the book, but this has been I came out of the arts. So my bachelor's degree is in design. Most of my undergraduate work is in painting or in, it's just in the arts, fine arts. And then I became an architect. I got my master's degree in architecture, and then I left that profession and became a detective, but a police officer first and then a detective. And I'll just tell you that there is something, creatives are different, and they are wildly independent and creative thinkers. They often say, if you like, for example, if you love to watch movies, and we watched a ton of 1940s Christmas movies and romantic comedies before Christmas, my wife and I. I don't know how I got
Wow.
started. I think we got started with Holiday Inn or something, it just went
Yeah.
off the rails, and we were just Googling on IMDb, what's the best 1940s sitcom or whatever. We watched so many. And there are these classic actors that are famous to this, at least my generation, the generation before me. And you don't want to Google them, because it turns out creative people often have train wreck kind of crazy lives,
Huh.
and that they're on, but that edge of their creativity. So don't be surprised that when you look at creatives, you often find them to be living on the very edge of their culture, which is what they're pushing envelopes, and they are creative in that sense that they're even breaking boundaries.
I didn't
So
even
it does.
when you mentioned that, I just remembered my wife and I went and saw this Van Gogh exhibit where they had art, and I was amazed at his story,
Yeah, his story is
how he
amazing.
was, it was sad how he, ended up committing suicide and, with drugs and alcohol, but he was a Christian, he was a missionary at one point, and it's just this bizarre story of mixture of both brilliance and creativity, and yet there's
And
that.
and 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 that's often the case with creatives. So I think that for us, what restrains us often as Christians is trying to submit every desire, every thought to Christ. And some of us have better success with that than others. And I think what I would suggest to anybody who's unfamiliar with the impact of Jesus in the arts, that you will not find a more significant influence in the history of art. And I'm talking about, if you go back and get a book on art history, it's going to have certain epic genres of art that are locked in the historic timeline, from antiquity all the way through to popism, to Dadaism, to impressionism, to whatever, surrealism, all the isms in art. And then I want you just to look for the top three masters in every ism. And if you
Who are
do,
some that stand out to you
well, I
as
mean,
far as
yeah. So, like, for example, if you're looking at pop art, like Andy Warhol or somebody like this, right, who's in the top three categories. And what I did in the book was give you a comprehensive list of all of these folks,
yes.
male and female, throughout history. And then I asked the simple question: well, if you were to search in their artistic catalog, would you be surprised to find that every single one of them has painted Jesus?
Wow.
Of all the historical figures they could have painted and been inspired by, and some of them are less, they're not painting him necessarily in the kindest light always. This is also true in music. All the top IMDb, Billboard, Rolling Stone artists in the last 150 years. Well, I got a list of all of them. I put it in the book. All but two had sung a song about Jesus, often in a very derisive way. My point is that Jesus inspires, infuriates. Why? What is it about this? By the way, you will find no other person in the history of persons who has this kind of impact on music or art. If you think you've got somebody, that's your burden. Show me who it is. In the book, I've tried to show you how every one of these artists and musicians has been deeply at least put it this way, not very few of them, especially in music. Not all of them are Christians. Now, there's an entire Christian music industry, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the secular music industry, right? And so a
Yeah.
lot of these are blasphemous songs. But that's interesting. Why sing a song at all? There's something about Jesus that either convicts you or inspires you. And
Yeah.
that's a very, and you can't be said about any other. And if you think about all the people who have lived, who have ruled nations, led armies, written sonnets, written concerts, written books, had great education, philosophers, world leaders, Jesus was none of that. He was none of those things. In his 3-year ministry, a ministry that ultimately led him to be chased from place to place, born in a small nowhere town, raised in another small nowhere town, never traveled more than about 200 miles. This is the guy who never had a formal education to speak of, not a wealthy family, didn't even have a family of his own with a wife and kids to leave, never led an army, never ruled a nation, never wrote a book. This is the guy. And if you put him alongside all of the other people of the first century and ask the simple question, which of these folks do you think will change everything? Which of these folks do you think will be a bigger inspiration than art? You would never guess it was Jesus of Nazareth.
Wow. Fascinating evidence. In closing, I know we need to wrap this up for your time's sake, but can you tell us a little bit about the impact that Jesus had on science? Because you said, as an atheist, this is one of the things that was kind of a, you didn't believe that Christianity had a good scientific basis. And a lot of the Christians that you met kind of had this anti-science attitude about them. How did Jesus impact some of the leading scientists?
Well, I think we, for the most part, will look at the state of science today, and there's a perception, which is accurate, that most people involved in the sciences are not necessarily Christians, but this was not always the case, and it does not need to be the case. As a matter of fact, even today, there are significant believers involved in all kinds of academic disciplines. So this shift, a large, I'm just going to say it, I think it's because we've surrendered it. This is the way it is because we have stepped out, not because we have been driven out because we don't belong there, because we have surrendered. By the
That's an
way,
interesting statement, because in your book, you make the case that it wasn't even after Darwin, there was
right.
still an abundance of Christians in academia and the sciences. So we can't just blame Darwin for this.
No,
I
no. As a
think
matter
you
of
make a
fact,
great point.
that generation with Darwin was very active amongst Christians. But
Yes.
David, I wrote this in the book that Muslims were very active from about the 8th century through about the 13th or 14th, and then suddenly stopped being involved in the sciences. It was a theological decision made amongst the leaders within Islam. Largely, there's a book called The Closing of the Muslim Mind that tries to explore what was really happening.
Wow.
But we know this is that you don't see Muslims dominating the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century. Those are Jesus followers. They're coming from the universities planted by Jesus followers, and they are remaining active, and they form and they establish and they father every major scientific discipline in modern science, all the way from modern astronomy to quantum mechanics. You will see that the founders and fathers of those disciplines are Christ followers. So we have to make a
Fascinating.
decision. We can change the course of this. But let's face it, you've also seen that we used to lead in education. We've planted those universities that now will not even allow a Christian voice to be heard on campus sometimes.
Yes. One
So
of the
this
things
is,
I like in your book is you say that even today, you take the leading universities, by just walking around on those campuses, you can take statements on
yeah,
buildings
yeah,
and make a case for mere Christianity, the basics of
that's
Christianity,
right. Yeah, you
by
can't.
those
As a matter of
top
fact,
institutions.
those buildings and those charters will tell you a lot about Jesus. And so in the book, I try to show you what just from the top 15 universities in the world today, all by the way, founded by Christians, you can go back there. And lucky for us, universities love to hang on to their old buildings because it kind of shows some stature, they've been there a long time. Well, those first buildings are sometimes chapels. They are places where Christians were teaching, and there were pictures, windows, images, scriptures that pointed to Jesus of Nazareth. And to the extent that those buildings have not been destroyed, you can reconstruct the story of Jesus from those campuses.
Jay Warner, thank you so much. Where's the best place for people to buy your book? And also, you got a great podcast. Your son's doing a great job as well. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, well, you can find us at coldcasechristianity.com. But this book, we have all kinds of free teaching materials to go along with the book, a huge PowerPoint, all of that for you to use and teach it yourself. And that's at personofinterestbook.com.
Personofinterestbook.com.
.com.
Jay Warner, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave. I appreciate it.